Hello? Hello, everyone. Welcome to the session. Can I start?
Yeah, just watch out around that speaker so you get feedback from my
Okay, no problem. Thank you so much for coming. I know it's almost lunchtime. It's very difficult to commit to any session at this time. And as you can see, we have a very good panel here too. The discussion was focused on UNESCO process and study about Internet universality. It's not shown here, but I remember the title is about from the connecting the dots to Internet universality, which more or less sketch our 2-year process from 2013. I mean, at that year, following the Snowden revelation, our member states had a very strong reaction and requested us to conduct a comprehensive study to address the issues of privacy and also in combination with other UNESCO competency area, access, free expression, and ethics, as well to provide options for future actions for the organization. So we have conducted a multi-stakeholder consultation in the first year in 2014. We started with a consultation with member states, 7 groups, regional groups, plus group 77 and China and also European Union. And then we have conducted at least 20 different consultations with different groups, like with intermediaries, with NGOs, with academia, with external stakeholders. So eventually, we have commissioned some experts to build on this consultation, as well as survey results we have conducted online, which received 200 responses. Actually, really pay tribute to those submitters. They respond to 30 key questions we asked relating to the 4 crucial areas. So eventually, we have done a very solid research. I think it's in your hand. Yes, it's called. Thank you. Keystones to foster inclusive knowledge society, access to information, knowledge, free expression, privacy, and ethics on global internet. It can be downloaded from UNESCO website. And how come we have the Connecting the Dots? That's a conference we organized last March. It's already 1 year. I think some of you have attended to discuss the first draft of this study. We did take in the views even in the middle of the study. And eventually it has provided 38 options as a recommendation for UNESCO to work beyond that. And last December, our general conference has eventually reviewed this study and also the Connecting the Dots outcome document, which is based on study and which has adopted 38 options, including one is very important is about Internet universality as a bold new framework to guide the organization on all its Internet-related issues. This Internet universality contains 4 pillar principles. It's called Rome. And I'm very happy Mr. Geiberger is here because I have witnessed him fabricating these Rome principles, which contains, yes, in one day email, he got a hunch that, okay, we can really make into a Rome principle because we are advocating 4 principles. First one is human rights. He took the R. And second one is openness. The third one is accessibility. Not access. The fourth one is a multi-stakeholder, so it's Rome. So now clearly the roaming principle is roaming to San Francisco, and our goal is to get to maybe roaming to everywhere for free. So I now like to Mr. Geitberger to elaborate on exactly this Rome works and how we want to measure them in the future. Because now the task for us is to implement it. That's why we have invited the experts on the panel to also tackle each aspect of them. So now, Guy, maybe you could speak more about the Rome.
Sure. Thank you very much, Zhan Hong, and thanks to our colleagues who've joined this panel. Just to add, if you do look at the study and you look at page 102, that's got the document that our member states agreed on. And the document says that UNESCO now supports this idea of Internet universality, by which we mean the ROAM principles. And so it was quite important to get a position in the UN that they adopt this. There are other important things in that document that they did accept. Part of the whole consultation process in building up to this position had contributions, for example, from the Freedom Online Coalition, who said that indicators would be a good idea to make this high-level kind of principles, normative framework more concrete. And so we worked with Andrew Pudafat over here, and he helped us do some thinking around this, and essentially came with saying there is a layers model of the internet, and there is your Rome model, and could you put them together? So we did a bit of work already, and now that was before even our member states agreed with the kind of formally with the concept and the mandate. But now we have a much stronger position to move ahead. And so I'll just give you a couple of slides just to help tell you what our thinking is at the moment, and then we're going to ask our colleagues to say what they think could be good indicators for the different ROAM. And the interesting thing about the indicators also is that in this UN system, these can become quite powerful. If you assess a country on how it's doing with rights, with openness, accessibility, and multi-stakeholderism, you know, they do pay attention, especially if it comes from within the UN system. And the idea is also that you could follow up a few years later and say, was there improvement or was there not improvement? So it's an influential thing to do indicators. Okay, so let me just get this thing here. And just a couple of slides to show you. Well, all of these I kind of stole off the internet, so no originality here. But I got this picture because I think this picture sums up the internet from the layers point of view. And the layers point of view, I'm stealing her from Fadi Chahadi, former head of ICAB, who explained the layers model in terms of a table. And you could say the internet was the table. I'm not sure who Elvis is there, Vince Cerf or who?
Al Gore.
Al Gore. At any rate, this was the early internet, American and mainly male, and you know, kind of free-for-all sort of stuff, as we all know. Then you get another iteration of the internet, of the Last Supper table. Not that we're at the Last Supper, but we have the South Park people, and the internet is really becoming a free-for-all at this point. But again, it's got a lot of bad behavior and so on and so forth. Anyway, now the interesting thing is, if you look at this kind of model of the table, and you take the layers, use the table metaphor, which is what Fadi Chahadi uses, and I think it's very useful. The legs of the table are clearly your infrastructure, your pipes, your signal towers, your transmission, your frequencies, and so on. What brings them together is the tabletop. And the tabletop, of course, is your internet names and numbers. It holds the legs of the table together. It's your HTTPS. It's the kind of the technical layer, what people like to say. Well, then there's a tablecloth, and what we've been trying to joke with is the tablecloth is the kind of overlay, which is the etiquette of the internet. And so the tablecloth can be pretty dirty, or the tablecloth can be pretty civil and clean, or this tablecloth can be very commercialized. Tablecloth can be very, the sharing model. Different kind of tablecloths. And then, of course, you get, on top of the tablecloth, you get your plates and forks and knives, and those are your apps, whether they're web browsers or things on your phone. And then, of course, you get the food, which is your content. And then you get who's sitting there, who actually sits at this table. Okay, so these are all important questions, particularly for internet governance, because who controls the different parts of the table, given that the table, it's a feast and there's just, it's all integrated. Now, how do you take that layers model, the table model of the internet, and bring in this other focus of ROAM? And so you can say that the table model is the horizontal model of the internet. And I've kind of been through those things. But the one problem with the table model and the layers model, it implies that the technical layers got nothing to do with other layers. It implies the infrastructure layer has got nothing to do with what's on the food. And so it gives you a lot of insight, this layers model, but it implies that these are kind of strata that are not necessarily interdependent. So with this internet universality proposal, just to remind you of those 4 principles, we thought you could show it a bit like this. Okay, and now you have the table, but you have light shining down on the table. So there's a green light, and that is your rights, which covers the whole table, and then all the different layers of the table, bathes them all in this thing. And then you have the openness, which is the blue light, and so on and so forth. So it's trying to kind of say, okay, we can understand the internet in some ways in terms of the horizontal, but if we want to look at things like privacy, privacy is not just an issue at one level. It's not just at the content level invading privacy. Privacy is down at the infrastructure level, at the technical level, et cetera, and the same with freedom of expression. And you can do the same across all the indicators. So somehow we have to have a model that is going to recognize these different layers, but also the vertical. And so that's essentially the challenge of trying to develop indicators. One of the challenges, because there are many others. So there you go. That's what we need to try to materialize this framework and all the cross-cutting transversal issues of openness, accessibility, multi-stakeholder participation at the different levels. So I think that just finishes off my summary of where we are, and we really now look forward to the wisdom of these people on the panel to tell us, okay, how would we begin to understand indicators for the different ROAM? Thank you.
Thank you, Guy. I think I've listened to his presentation on Rome many times, but every time you got some new ideas, a new light, new graphics, and really very inspiring. So now I would like to move to our panelists. Maybe let me start we do it vertically at first. Okay, we'll start from Rome, the human rights aspect of the Rome principles. We have two experts on human rights sitting in front of us. So what do you think how we really elaborate the human rights aspect in this Internet Universality framework? What do you suggest to us? Thank you. So this one, the first speaker is Miss Miss Eileen. I'm sorry, I couldn't pronounce your name properly. Could you teach me? Maybe you can. Eileen Donoghue. Could you also please introduce yourself briefly on the new position?
Very briefly, I work at Human Rights Watch, Director of Global Affairs, and I focus largely on this portfolio of the intersection between digital rights, cybersecurity, digital security, and internet governance.
Okay, excellent. Because we have the limited time to 12:15, so if you can kindly limit your speech into 5 minutes, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank
Absolutely.
you.
So I sort of 3 points to make. The first of which is, well, let me start by saying I think it was fantastic that you chose to integrate Rome and the layers. I think I remember some of those early conversations where there was the possibility of going with one or the other. I think they are intricately related. My first point on the rights dimension is that all aspects of the Rome concept or framework are related to rights. So the rights part, obviously, but openness is a human rights issue. And for me, I always think of that in terms of the open, interoperable platform is the place where rights are exercised. And the fact that it's global and it enables the exercise of rights. So that's why that openness is a human rights issue. Access, it's access to information. That's a human right. Access to connection technology is, it facilitates the exercise of rights, or you could think of it almost as an ESC right in and of itself, different people. And then multi-stakeholder-ism or approach or whatever the terminology is relates to participation, inclusion, diversity of views. Those are connected to the exercise of human rights and protection of human rights. So similarly, your layers model, all of those layers, you actually said this, you brought up privacy and free expression, all the legs, the table, the tablecloth, and the food on the table, all related to human rights. If you break down the architecture and you have fragmentation at the architectural level, you've broken the open interoperable internet. That affects human rights. If you, obviously takedowns affect, if you take something off the table, it affects human rights. If you make it impossible at the protocol layer for things to speak to each other and to get things, allow communication to get around the globe, you've affected the exercise of human rights. So first point is simply Rome, every aspect of it is about human rights. Second point, I would say what is a little bit lacking in the Rome concept is the notion that security is a human right. Articles, I think you've got it as, you've got freedom of expression, privacy, cultural diversity, sustainable development. Security is also, Article 3 of the Universal Declaration is about security of persons. And I think it's very important in the context of the growing cyber vulnerability that we all face, as well as the context of counterterrorism, to remember human rights are not in opposition to security, and that human rights points to both the security and freedom, and they are, again, interrelated. I think it's very important for everybody, especially if you care about human rights, is to get out of the binary framing. Because if you pit human rights and freedom against security, you will lose that battle. In the context of all the vulnerabilities we face and counterterrorism, you've set it up as reinforcing the dominant other. And the reality is you cannot exercise your freedom if you don't have security. So I just don't let go. Security it belongs to you. And then yes, human rights is an afterthought. It's not. It is essential to the trust of your population, and in a democratic system, it has been understood that the protection of human rights is an aspect of strength. It's not an afterthought, or it doesn't come second to the protection of security. It's inherent to protection of security. And therefore, when you're engaged in protection of security, it can't be at the expense of human rights and the rule of law, because that's how you undermine your security. So the basic idea here is these things are indivisible, interrelated, mutually reinforcing, and don't let anybody think security is not your issue.
Thank you so much. I think we do agree with you, and thank you for this holistic understanding of this concept and putting insight in the security. Very useful for us. And before we go to Mrs. Sanya Kelly, I also like to inform that actually all of you are free to join us from Slido, give your question, comments, and we will definitely leave time to address all of them. Of course, you can also let me know if you want to intervene after our panelists speaking. So I'm now very happy to introduce our second speaker, Ms. Sanya Kelly from Freedom House. And we all read your Freedom on Net report, and it's really a good opportunity to have your view here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak. I have also found Rome principles quite fascinating, and I'm personally very encouraged that there is this holistic approach to the internet. I agree with you that we have observed and considered many of these items in isolation, so seeing how they're all interrelated is essential. Like Eileen, my first observation after seeing the principle was how connected they are to each other and how they lead to human rights. Because when Freedom House, for example, observes and evaluates internet freedom, when it comes to issues like access, for example, we do consider that to be an essential part of human rights and essential part of internet freedom. So therefore, it almost seems like that there should be some sort of map of the whole Rome principles and kind of all the arrows pointing towards the top where human rights are upheld. One of the things that also jumped out at me when I was looking at different components that you currently have under freedom and human rights, which would be freedom of expression, privacy, cultural diversity, and sustainable development, is that I believe that you should also have freedom of association and assembly there, because that is a very important aspect in cyberspace as well. And it's definitely one that we as Freedom House have noticed to be constantly and increasingly under threat. Just to give you an example, when we looked at our research last year, we have noticed a dramatic increase in different governments trying to actually stifle activism online. And what that means is actually blocking the information or you're looking at Rome principles. And then, of course, it's very useful to break them down as you have, as I mentioned, for freedom and human rights. And then the question becomes what comes after that. So essentially, I think that is what you're getting at, what each of these concepts really encapsulates. And I know with the Connecting Dots conference, you guys have done a terrific job at really looking at these specific issues. So for example, with freedom of expression, things like blocking and filtering or content takedowns and so forth have really come out as important. So my encouragement would be to then take each of these concepts and then really separate them and try to identify, what each of them encapsulates. And as I mentioned, that can be looking at blocking and filtering. It can be, we can look at content takedown. But I think issue like self-censorship is also extremely important because we see an increase of that across the world, and it's something that not many organizations and not many entities are being effective at capturing. The reason why I think that self-censorship component is also important is because, when I look at some of the other objectives of UNESCO, whether that be girls' education or, access by different groups, whether they be marginalized groups, those are very much cross-cutting issues because when I look at the communities online, very often they're not able to express themselves, not necessarily because the government is going to block their information, but because they're afraid of societal repercussions, and that is something that is very real, and it's really limiting the amount of information online. So that's the reason. Another point is to really try to capture that as effectively as possible. I think given the limited time, it's almost impossible to go through each of these, but I noticed that cultural diversity is also one of the issues, and that very much really touches upon this issue of content and how marginalized communities are able to express their views as well as access information that is relevant to them, because we have seen that many countries are actually targeting information related to these marginalized communities through blocking and other means. So then so for example, what we've seen in a number of countries is that, a particular forum will be blocked because it is a forum about, a minority religion or about a minority group. So I agree with you that that's very important. However, the point I would like to make here is that I really would not want us to fall into the trap of cultural relativism when it comes to looking at freedom of expression and human rights as a whole, because what we have seen in a number of settings and by a number of governments is that they're using essentially this cultural relativism to say, this is the reason why we're blocking this information. It is because it's just not part of our culture. We're going to, block this information about minority groups or minority religions because our culture is predominantly, something else. Or what we've seen in a number of Arab countries, for example, is that issues related to women are often restricted for that reason. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for pointing out the important issue on content related to the blocking, censorship, and self-censorship. Because I remember the tweet on ResCon saying that Snowden has drawn all the attention to surveillance, but we need also address class issues like blocking and the content issues. Thank you very much. And I think the second pillar of the Rome is openness. I'm very happy that our speaker, Mr. Alon Barr, who is a co-founder of Ranking Digital Rights, I would believe all of you have known about it, is going to share some view. And also like to introduce that Alon Barr and also Rebecca has been commissioned to do a UNESCO study on internet intermediaries 2 years ago. It's also a very useful resource to help you and us to reflect on the indicator on the openness. Thank you. Yours.
Thank you, Shenhong. Perhaps co-founder of Ranking Digital Rights is a bit too much honor for me, but I'm indeed a part of the Ranking Digital Rights project. And for us, this is a very interesting framework to think about Rome. And part of the thing that is interesting to me about it is that it really helps us think through what exactly does the internet mean for people around the world, and to look at it through different angles that otherwise perhaps would not have been explored in that same way. So I very much welcome this initiative and also the opportunity to speak to it. As to openness, openness invites a lot of questions. What does openness mean? What does it imply? What does it mean for people in different parts of the world? One thing that Eileen touched on is interoperability of platforms. That is one major aspect of it for sure. And in that vein, it is interesting to see that from the initial idea of the internet, of it being very decentralized, accessible to everyone in the same way, it seems that roles have changed a little bit over the past years, in the sense that there's increasing importance of online intermediaries in sort of mediating the communication that goes online between individuals around the world, which means that there is a greater responsibility and greater power that individual companies, for example, have on the way that people can communicate with each other. One very basic example of this is that, let's say 15 years ago, many of the communications online went by email between individuals. Nowadays, you'll see that many communications go on a specific platform, whether that is Twitter, whether that is Facebook, or anything else. But you'll see that that means that people cannot communicate with each other between those platforms, right? It sort of adds an extra layer, an extra barrier in between, rather than retaining the openness. Of course, such platforms also enable a great deal of expression, and we should recognize that as well. But it also means that platforms that have a certain market power can influence the way that people can communicate with each other, the way people's rights are being respected. And I thank my colleagues here on the panel for outlining the key ways that rights are being affected on the internet. Openness also begs the question of transparency. From what we are seeing with the Ranking Digital Rights Project, where we have set standards and trying to sort of outline what online companies and internet service providers should be doing to respect the users' rights, that transparency is often missing. This means that people around the world often do not have an idea of how their rights are being respected and what they can expect when they are using a certain service. Now, in circumstances where you see that large corporations hold certain market power, this can be a problematic issue, especially when you think about internet service providers. And oftentimes in many markets there are just a few internet service providers. This means that people are rather dependent on the choices that these service providers make and the decisions that they make on, for example, whether to block certain content, whether to tamper with net neutrality or not. And as a consequence, the way that individuals can access the free flow of information that we all envision the internet to be are harmed, and they may not necessarily have the alternative to seek somewhere else to get that information. So when we're thinking about openness, I think sort of that open access to information that exists around the world is a really important issue. In that vein, internet service providers are making decisions that are critically important. Blocking websites is one of them that I mentioned. Connect together, and how we want to make sure that we're doing well, and that companies and governments are doing well in this regard. And I'm happy that we're able to discuss the more specific ways, specific indicators that we should be looking at, and I hope we can talk further about that in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Alon, for telling us such a rich multi-layers within the openness, and also you show the connectiveness to other pillar. So it's very natural I'm introducing our expert from Brazil. His name is Mr. Mario Viola, or Viola. Thank you for this openness. And he's from the Institute for Technology and Technology and the Society of Rail. So now, could you please share your view about the third pillar of Rome indicator on the accessibility? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning to all. It's good afternoon now. It's a nice opportunity to discuss those principles, the Roman principles. And when I saw the principles, I was also quite excited about the idea of connecting the dots. It's the title of the session, because they are really interrelated. And most of them, and I think, not to say all of them, but as is the case of the accessibility, they represent human rights in itself. Accessibility is the access to information, the access to knowledge, and even the access to internet is being considered as a human right, and as some other panelists have said, and it's also a means to exercise other human rights. Because now, for example, to exercise fully the right to freedom of expression, the use of the internet, the plain access, the full access to internet is an important mean. When we talk about accessibility, I think we talk about different layers of accessibility. The first one, I think it's the infrastructure of the internet and the internet coverage. There are some areas in the world, and something that's been discussed in recent years, that we need to include more people in the net, because there are some areas that have no coverage, and it's an obstacle to accessibility. So that's the first point I'd like to highlight. Then we have the issue of affordability, which means how people can access the internet. They have the necessary means, they have the resources, the financial resources to do that. And then we go to the idea of mobile, to use different layers of the spectrum, cheap computers, and so on. So we have also this financial issue involved. Telecommunication agents last year announced that it would exclude from the net some non-certified mobiles based on their email, and then we relate to human rights again, because you have some freedom of expression issues, some privacy issues, and so on. And then I think the final dot, or the final layer of this whole chain of accessibility is the issue of literacy, because many people, they just don't know how to use the internet, they don't know how to access the internet, so we have to deal with educational issues. So we have to promote the education, the digital education, we have to stimulate, we have to include in the educational program of public schools, and it's something that it's a real challenge, especially in developing countries as Brazil, India, and others. So we've been facing some problems in including people, in giving access, and sometimes it's even difficult to have access to public services without having access to the internet. So I believe accessibility is not a matter of just using a computer or accessing the internet, but it's a fundamental tool for the exercise of many different fundamental rights and many different human rights. I think that's my short message for today. I just have 5 minutes.
Well, you have well capitalized 5 minutes to deliver very rich ideas. Yes, we do agree with you in terms of accessibility to be interpreted as a capacity, as a kind of inclusion as well. Actually, I do appreciate the anonymous speaker of this RightsCon conference. We already got 3 questions, and the first one really helped me to moderate the session. So on behalf of our anonymous speaker, the next question is, what is multi-stakeholderism, and how can one measure it? That is exactly the question I would like to... Yes, thank you. So now I move to our last 2 speakers to address this crucial question and the difficult one. And Mr. Andrew Pudefe, he is a director of Global Partners and Association. And could you please share first your view about multi-stakeholderism and how we measure it? Thank you.
Sure, thanks. Firstly, just to say as a preface, I think the importance of this approach is that for the first time a UN agency endorsed by its member states has supported a framework for the internet that guarantees human rights and internet freedoms. And to have a normative UN statement is a tremendous sort of piece. It means a lot of things to different people. In the internet world, I think it arose very much at the engineering stage, where you brought together all the people with relevant knowledge to arrive at a consensus about a particular engineering standard. And in terms of engineering, one can see how that process works fairly easily. In policy terms, where there are direct clashes of interests at stake, it's much harder to construct a multi-stakeholder process. Not harder, but certainly more challenging than it is at the engineering layer. So in that sense, the layers, kind of matter in terms of how you deliver multi-stakeholderism. For me, the core of multi-stakeholderism is, putting it crudely, instead of having interstate geopolitical competition deciding the future of the internet based on factors irrelevant to what's good for the internet or good for the user, you create a policy process where all the relevant actors who need to be at that table to arrive at the policy solution are there with the relevant information in a transparent and accountable form. And that's a very different policy process from the traditional UN-based interstate negotiations, which tend to bring in a lot of extraneous factors that are not to do with the structure and health of the internet. So that's really the challenge. And I think a few years ago it would have been a fairly elite process. It could still be an elite process. But now we have new techniques for engaging, for crowdsourcing, for publishing online. We actually have the internet and the web as tools. We can actually also see how the multi-stakeholder process can be far more democratic and transparent and open than traditional interstate processes. And the kind of work being done by my colleague Lee Casper with GovLab in New York, which is exploring how to develop consultative and open policy processes, I think is a very important part of the mix and would form part of the kind of indicator set going forward. So if we thought about what indicators would look like, which is the brief that Guy's given us, in multi-stakeholderism, I think, well, firstly, there would be a set of indicators around participation. So, and I would be particularly interested in what's the level of engagement of public interest in consumer groups in the policy formulation of any particular area of interest. What is the representation of the private sector? Is it that it shouldn't just be confined to a small number of large social media companies who, with their policy staff, tend to dominate the private sector contribution to our debates, but it needs to pick up, for example, the SME sector and the SME sector in the developing world. It needs to pick up the infrastructure companies, all the companies who deliver the relevant services, again, depending on the issue at stake. And it obviously has to have the right kind of government representation and participation, because governments are, in terms of law and policy, the source of legitimacy and authority in this field. I think the second area of indicators is around information. So does that policy process bring to bear all the relevant information, evidence and data that it needs to have to make a sensible policy decision? And is that information open and transparent? And can we all contribute information, evidence and data to that policy process? Because again, we now have techniques that allow ordinary users to input into that policy process. So I'll be looking for an information process that is both solid and robust, but one that is also open for broader public participation and public input. There's then a set of indicators around the transparency of the process itself. So if you have a multi-stakeholder process that isn't purely interstate, who is at that table? Why are they at that table? Where did they come from? And what's their own accountability and transparency in the way they operate? And are each of those participants in that multi-stakeholder process, again, open to bringing in views from a broader constituency, because you cannot represent yourself in a multi-stakeholder process. You have to see yourself as partly a representative, but also partly a curator of a much broader constituency that you're trying to bring into that process. And the final area I'd look for is around accountability. Having got a multi-stakeholder process, what is the accountability back to the constituencies who you, if you like, represent or are participating on behalf of within that process? How do you report back? How do you say, this is why I'm here, this is what I'm trying to do, these are the information sources I've gathered from you for my crowdsourcing platforms, this is how I feed back to you what's the outcome of that process, and how do you then feed back to me about how you feel about that? And I think if you take those kind of areas of participation, information, transparency and accountability, you begin to see the outline of a set of indicators that assess a true multi-stakeholder process. And I think we've got some way to go in building that. And that's why I think instead of simply talking about multi-stakeholder processes and then never really examining them, which is what happens, what I'm hoping the UNESCO process gives us the opportunity to do is really go into some detail about what a genuine multi-stakeholder process could look like and how it should function, so that we can put some robustness on it, because there's a danger at the moment that it's merely a slogan that governments are increasingly, fed up with or trying to find ways round. Not all governments, but some governments who don't want to have multi-stakeholder processes, don't want to have democratic participation, want an internet that's controlled by states in the interests of states. We need to come up with something that's a bit stronger and robust to set against those traditional processes. So that would be my initial thinking on what that indicator framework would look like.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for all your insights into this. Actually, we also plan to do a really in-depth research into this multi-stakeholderism. I also like to take the opportunity to pay tribute to Andrew, who has done, and his team has conducted a very important study in 2012 about free expression and privacy, which definitely inform us to develop our roaming framework. And last but not least, I want to introduce Mr. Nicolas Selder from Internet Society, ISOC. It's also one of our longer partners who have been working together with Alon on the intermediary study, which is purely a multi-stakeholder project, I can assure you. So, Nicola, I understand you not only want to talk about multi-stakeholderism, and also you have such a, ISOC also has such a expertise in openness. Maybe you could combine your opinion on this. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and good afternoon. So first of all, I think that just getting back to the Rome framework, I think it's, as other speakers have said, it's very interesting. There are other indicators out there, but I think that the sort of uniqueness of this framework is that it sort of mixes governance, technical, social, economic elements, and I think that's an interesting mix to have a full picture of what an internet experience can be nowadays. Now, I think that one of the key challenges we have is to go from principles to impact. In the last few years, many organizations, many groups have affirmed, committed to multi-stakeholder processes, to openness, etc. But what does it mean in practice? And I think that developing indicators for that can be useful. But the first step and the first challenge, I think, is to have a common understanding of those terms. And I think it's interesting that we have those panels because, what openness is to Alan might be something different for me. What multi-stakeholder means to me might mean, something else to someone in a different country or, from a different background. So I think that, as part of that indicators process, defining clearly those terms, but not only defining them, but trying to gather a consensus on what they mean is essential. An additional aspect to that, I think, is also the language aspect. Again, for an English native, multi-stakeholder might mean something. When you translate it in French, in Spanish, or something else, that can lead to different understandings. I've had very concrete examples where I had to review within ISOC papers that were translated from English to French, and I've even seen multi-stakeholder being translated to multilateral, which is usually the synonymous for between governments. So you can see how the importance to also have a sort of cross-cultural understanding of those terms can be essential, I think, as a first step. Now, talking about multi-stakeholderism, which is really a mouthful of a term, it rhymes with pragmatism, and I think that we actually need to live up to that, similarity in terms. As Andrew said, I think that in the past few years, for those who have been involved in internet governance discussions, there's been a lot of use of those terms, multi-stakeholderism, openness, more in terms of like belief systems or values. Your people are for it, other people are against it. And I think we need to move from that sort of politicization of the terms and move to a more, again, pragmatic approach to those terms. So I think that, one step to get there is to define the elements that are part of multi-stakeholderism, and Andrew highlighted a few I think I agree with, participation, inclusiveness, transparency, what's the efficiency of the process, etc. So defining this framework, but also understanding that the multi-stakeholder processes is not one single model. And I think, again, many of us are guilty of promoting the multi-stakeholder model in the past few years, and we need to recognize that that's a framework that has constitutive elements that may be applied differently in different cases. Again, the way decisions are taken in the IGF multi-stakeholder advisory group are different than the OECD, are different than than the Net Mundial, for example, but I think that across these different examples, you can see those same elements applied in different ways. I think as well that the strongest argument for multi-stakeholder processes is also to sort of try to show the concrete benefits of it. Again, shifting away from just saying this is great, you know, that's the way it should be. You know, having case studies that show that including relevant people with relevant expertise, people that had a stake in a specific issue, actually led to a more legitimate policy, legitimate outcome, a more efficient outcome. I think bringing evidence and case studies can reinforce the model, again, shifting away from a belief to something more pragmatic. And you know, and finally, I think that, you know, if we can get to defining these elements, to bring evidence to that, we will be able to get to a more normative stage where we can say, well, in this case, you know, you should actually apply those elements of the multi-stakeholder model because we think that, you know, this is more efficient, this is more democratic, etc. So, you know, I think that, you know, the UNESCO approach to it is really good, and, you know, getting back to my earlier point, having a common understanding of those terms is clearly necessary, because otherwise, you know, if you get to point B and you realize people didn't think about those terms the same way, you sort of are on a shaky foundations. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. Actually, ISOC was also quite involved in the early stage when we start to develop Rome principles. And now I see our brilliant anonymous speaker raise another brilliant question. Was living freedom out of the Rome acronym a deliberate choice? If so, why? You see guys smiling because we did have a harsh debate on that 2 years ago. And UNESCO is an agency specialized in promoting freedom expression. Freedom is so dear to us, and we love it so much to missing out. But eventually we decide to use human rights based rather than freedom in the Rome principle. So maybe Guy, you would like to share some of our idea at the time?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think Rome is better than foam, but but more seriously, the difficulty of talking about freedom is that it can mean lots of different things. Well, anything can mean lots of different things, but freedom, I think, by and large, can be used as the freedom from restraint. And if you speak about rights, of course, freedom can also be freedom, not just from, but freedom for. But we thought, basically, if you bring together the package of human rights, that can be taken as a definition of freedom. That if you don't have rights, you don't have freedom. You know, people may differ. People may say freedom is the absence of restraint. But at the same time, if you take a rights thing, you also need to speak about the role of the state in protecting and enabling something. So it's not purely a restraint. So in a way, there is a philosophical basis here to say that from this perspective, freedom is human rights.
Yes, I agree. And also, I think, you know, we work with so many 195 member states. I mean, they really have a different interpretation to the freedom. When we say human rights, we mean many fundamental freedoms, ranging from freedom expression to privacy, to security, to culture, to education. But the freedom can risk being narrowly interpreted by some country into maybe only a certain one type of the right. So that's why I want to take a holistic approach to this human rights based. It's really addressing the rights, all the rights on the internet.
Could I just add one thing, which to throw the discussion back, but how important is it if you try and take a package of rights to not just say, you know, well, this right's being respected, but to say, how is the reconciling happening? Because as we know, sometimes the reconciling ends up, you know, too much of an intrusion or a squashing of one right at the expense of the other. So could you and should you develop indicators to look at key challenges, for example, freedom of expression and privacy, security and freedom of expression, and association and security, and so on? To what extent should indicators try and look at the possible clashes?
I think that's an excellent question, and I think the answer has to be yes, which doesn't make it easy to do. So many different things. So many people pointed out that the terminology, every single word here is on some level contested and complex and multidimensional. And going from terminology to indicators is really difficult. And, that's going to be a lot of hard work. If you then have to cross different terms as well, but it adds a whole, like a third dimension. But I will come back to something Sonia said, which is this concept of universality. And at the end of the day, in a digital environment, it's transborder, and we do end up needing something that is universally applicable. It's not culture by culture in a bordered space that one country gets to control. We are all now interrelated, and in that sense, the one piece that I'm optimistic about is that the universal human rights framework is well suited. It doesn't make it easy to go from words to indicators. It is as almost ahead of its time in its relevance because it's applicable in a transborder context.
Andrew, you want to?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about any indicator exercise is it makes you operationalize values, which you often don't have to do in our world. I mean, quite often you can just go around saying, I want this and I want that, but you never have to think about how to actually get it. So if you take Eileen's proposition, which I think is really crucial to understand, that security and human rights are actually fused concepts and should not be seen as separate or conflicting concepts. Operationally, what that means, one of the consequences of that, is that those charged with the security of a people, the police and intelligence agencies, need to be around the table with those of us who promote human rights values and core principles. And not in separate rooms, not in separate conferences, and not shouting at each other and refusing to engage in dialogue, but actually sitting down together to figure out how that integration takes place, and how a human rights concept can be built into a security framework, just as we have to think in our terms about the challenges of building a security framework into our human rights values. Now, that's a really interesting exercise, and it's one that I think, frankly, we're maturing to a point where we can think about it, but I would say it's still quite difficult to conceive of how you would put that kind of process together. But I think that's where, if you talk about operationalizing these things, as opposed to just saying a statement, that's the kind of direction we need to go in. And I think the indicator exercises would have to throw up those kinds of challenges, not just to states, but to civil society, to be mature enough to engage in a very different kind of conversation, where we don't just talk to ourselves about the things we agree with in a kind of groupthink exercise, which any self-selecting group of people is going to tend towards, but actually we talk to people we don't necessarily agree with, whose interests and values are very different to ours, and whose concerns and remits and mandates are very different to ours. That, I think, is the next stage for internet policy discussions. I'm excited about that, because I think it represents a maturing of the debate, but I think we shouldn't underestimate the challenge of doing that.
And, Alon?
Thanks. Building on the previous two comments, I recognize indeed that on one hand, sort of building out indicators is very, very challenging. It took us with ranking digital rights a few years to build sufficiently strong indicators to be able to actually put out public ranking and index. At the same time, operationalizing values, as Andrew points out, is really important, and it forces you to be extremely clear about what you want to get at. And in that sense, it's also, the third point is it's an extremely satisfying thing to do, because it actually puts the values that you're looking for out, it tests it out in the real world. Right, so you have ideas, you have recommendations, you're trying to operationalize them, you're trying to be very precise, and then you can actually test, okay, what does this deliver? And is this indeed what we are trying to get at? And quite naturally, the results will not be perfect. Quite naturally, results of any sort of indicator will not be as precise as desired, but it is a very helpful exercise, I think, in order to get at the values and the results that you want to see out there in the world, and in the end to be able to say, well, actually, this value compares better than that value, or that result is a clearer, better practice than other results. So I think it's a great exercise to go through, and hopefully we'll actually improve things.
Yeah, great. And Nicola?
Yeah, I mean, very much in the same vein. I mean, I'm actually personally interested to see, when you will apply this framework, if you can also find correlations between the different elements of the Rome. For example, does more openness lead to a better respect of rights, or that relationship between those elements will be, I think, really interesting, and a finding that could be useful on the way forward as well.
Yes, I think I agree. Actually, I should also say that since every speaker has already addressed different pillars, and you also have an opportunity to address those cross-cutting issues among these pillars. And also, meanwhile, we'll open the floor to the audiences. You are free to give your comments or questions. And we're also having an opportunity to maybe to address to the second question from the anonymous speaker. It's also a very interesting one. What will the indicator creation process look like? Two parts. This is the first part about the indicator creation process look like. Second, will there be avenues for outside researchers and organizations to be involved? It's a very pragmatic question. We are really lucky to have a discussion on this. And Guy, you want to start, or maybe, because you're asking about how the creation process of indicator look like. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on this.
Add one more question to that because it's related.
Yes, please.
On a very basic level, when we create indicators, one of our first questions is that how exactly they're going to be used and what's your main purpose for them. So, for example, is the main purpose to hold your member states accountable? Is the main purpose to evaluate treaties, as you've done through one of your studies? So I think in addition to the questions posed by Mr. or Mrs. Anonymous, I think I would be also interested in these answers, because as someone who creates indicators for a living, I think that would be one of the starting points.
Okay, so now we have expanded the question to a big question. Why you do this, and how you do this, and then how will you implement this? And so, Guy, you are ready to address a little bit, and then we also...
Well, I can make a few comments.
Okay.
I think what is important is that this framework and these indicators are coming from a UNESCO perspective. That's why in the beginning we didn't put safety and security, because in the UN system it's not UNESCO's mandate to do safety and security. Although I personally would accept the argument, the right to safety and security is one of your rights, but it's not really the kind of area that UNESCO works in. We're not Interpol, for example. But nevertheless, we would focus, I think, in this thing on the issues that actually are in our field of work. And you mentioned some of them: cultural diversity, schooling for girls, freedom of expression, privacy. So those things, those would be prioritized, because this thing will mainly speak, I think, to, in the Secretariat, us and our colleagues, and in our member states and the kind of participation they have in UNESCO. But of course we want the indicators to be very relevant to civil society, that they could use for advocacy as well, to academia, corporates, tech people and so on. But in terms of the actual process of developing them, I should say that Andrew did help us go quite a long way, and he's worked a lot with UNESCO in the past in developing media development indicators and then journalism safety indicators. So we hope that we'll be able to carry on the journey with him here. But we're busy. We've developed a proposal to have a global consultation and then to have pilots in 3 countries. So currently we're trying to fundraise for that. And if we can get that, we will roll this thing out in the next 18 months.
I'll just add, if you take the media indicators that UNESCO agreed in 2008, I think the concrete answer to Sania's question is 40 countries have subsequently used those indicators as part of the process of reforming their media environment. So for me, the advantage of UNESCO's indicators is not, it has a normative effect, it has an advocacy effect, as do Freedom House. A lot of indicators do that. The real balance here is these are indicators that are developed for states, endorsed by states, and can be used by states to actually create an environment. And UNESCO has a lot of influence particularly in parts of the developing world, where people who say, well, we want to, I was in Bhutan as part of an exercise, and The King said, we need to reform our media environment. We don't know how to do it. Let's get UNESCO in and use their media indicators with a local research team to actually reform our media environment, which is what they did. And that's been a process that's happened in a number of countries. Croatia was the very first to do that back in 2009. And about 40 countries, I think, subsequently have used them in one way or another. So that's the value of having a UN-endorsed system, that countries that feel they don't have the capacity to think through these issues for themselves say, okay, let's take this process and apply it to our own country and see where we get. And I think in the next stage of this exercise, we will probably field test it. I think one is Brazil, because the initial supporters of this process was LACNIC and CGI Brazil. So I think they will field test it. Probably Ghana and probably a country like Denmark. So we'd probably field test it in 3 or 4 countries of very, very different capacities and very different states of development.
And any more comments from you on this? And yeah, Mariel.
The Brazilian comment, I don't know, because yesterday we had a report from the Brazilian Parliament proposing to amend many different pieces of legislation, and if it passes, it will change completely the way Brazil deals with the internet. So let's see what will happen.
Thank you. Actually, the question has contained a second part of how will if I remember correctly, how will the research organization can be involved in the indicator development? I think the answer is yes. What do you think?
Yes, absolutely. But I think those who are here, please keep in touch with us directly. And I'm sure once we start this big consultation process, we will be inviting research organizations as well as other stakeholders. And I'm sure we'll take the kind of powerful wisdom that we're getting from experts like these, work with Andrew and others, and we'll come with a more detailed document with draft indicators even that we can discuss further. So it's an open process. It should be as Nicolas said, drawing on multi-stakeholder participation and hopefully efficient, and we should come up with something that's usable. And I think, just to echo what Andrew said, these media development indicators have been really useful in not only for states, but for other actors as well. Journalism educators, media themselves, media houses, in all over places like Tunisia, Pakistan, Jordan, and so on.
Yeah, and indicators, and for UNESCO, we are very used to this systematic approach to assess the intervention need for different project purpose, like a very good example given by Andrew. That's why we kind of follow up to our good practice approach, how we address the internet-related issues, how we really give a very systematic, holistic suggestion to our member state to identify the active, the pro, and to be needed to help with the internet and its development. So,
can I just add that the indicators UNESCO does are not comparative in the way that the Freedom House is.
Exactly.
So we don't rate one government against another. In UN terms, that would be a complete no-no if you started saying this country's better than that country or scores more highly. So they play a very, they are self-contained, if you like, and they don't imply any comparison. They recognize that you can have a country with a high level of development and a lower level of freedom. It tries to develop the complexity of the mix. So they will draw upon the Freedom House indicators and other indicators as data inputs and as for ideas. But they will be designed within a UN framework, which is obviously very different from an advocacy framework that Freedom House would be able to use.
Yes, exactly. We're also trying to base the indicator on the very neutral and in data from different sources. That's one requirement. I think I see an intervention request from audience. Before that, I think Guy.
Very quickly.
Yes, I think
to
Guy has a
Andrew
quick comment.
I think the main, and Sonia, the main purpose of this is to produce something that can be used in the nation state. The problem, of course, is that when you're dealing with these issues, a lot of things are outside of the purvey of the nation state and its actors. So it does raise also an interesting question to what extent one would try and develop global level indicators. So one would say, well, for example, in international telecoms regulation, what is the rights, openness, accessibility, multi-stakeholder, in World Trade Organization, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a different take, but it's something that I think we have to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, and sir,
probably don't need that, but thank you.
Could you introduce yourself briefly before you speak? Thank you.
My name is Seamus Toohey. I work at Internews, which is an international media development organization, and I follow hundreds of indicators and different groups who do really amazing studies year after year or every couple of years that touch on a lot of these points. Obviously, many of them are up on the stage right now. And I'm wondering if UNESCO is going to leverage these existing resources to kind of ease in the kind of ongoing process of evaluating different nations and providing them resources to evaluate themselves, or if the indicators that are created out of this project are going to be, because they have to be obviously a little bit more separated, not directly tied to kind of sub-indicators or resources like that.
Thank you for this question. So,
can I just,
yes, yes, Andrew, please.
The baseline would be you would take all the existing indicator sets, and that would be part of the analysis. You'd be trying to draw upon applying them within the UN framework, which is different to the one they probably haven't developed. You would seek to draw upon the best lessons from each of them to apply in that particular framework. So the starting point would essentially be desk research to actually incorporate all of those within the Rome framework, because obviously that's a very different, that's a different kind of categorization of how you organize them. So you do that, that's your starting point. Then you have the kind of consultations and you draw the crowdsourcing through web platforms to get fresh ideas in from other constituencies. And then you cement that through some kind of face-to-face meetings and then case studies in a couple of countries, which then refine them, frighten the set. So the process goes through about 4 or 5 iterations, essentially. But it starts with the work that's been done now by Ranking Digital Rights, by Freedom House, by everyone else on Internet Indicators.
Yeah, I think we only have 5 minutes. Yeah, no, 3 minutes. My watch is slow. So that if there are no questions from the audience, I will go to each of our speakers for maybe last tweet or last comment. Anything from you? Okay, so maybe we start to have our speaker. Okay, you want to speak? Yes, please. Excellent.
I'm Nara Shazaya. We came from Mongolia. So, first of all, I just would like to say that my organization, which is the Global International Center, used the 2 UNESCO indicators. One is media development indicators. The other one is gender sensitive indicators for media. And I would say that this is a really exciting learning process to use these indicators. And actually, I would say that these indicators are value-based because it says what should we sow, and we are learning while doing it. And I very much supported Nicholas' idea about the common language and the common understanding, because you know that we had really different reviews with our Communications Regulatory Commission on the issues. But while we were working and we were trying to constructively engage them, now we have very good cooperation with the CRC. Now we are working on some legal reform on freedom of expression issues. So when are these indicators expected to come? Because when? Yes, and because we are very keen to test these indicators.
Thank you. You seem you can't wait to see the indicator to be put in place. Okay, so who can give an estimated time frame? It sounds a big challenge, yes, and maybe Guy.
How about the same time, same date next year at RightsCon? No, I'm just kidding. I think it will be at least 18 months.
18 months? It sounds okay, huh? Not too slow. And so now I think we are already at time, but I would still like our speaker to give a last tweet. So, Mariola.
I'm just glad to hear that UNESCO is involved on that and that you are proposing some principles to govern the internet and to guide member states that maybe don't have an idea on how to do that, don't have discussed that. So it's a good starting point, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a great initiative, and we would be happy to support it in any way we can with our own indicators and mistakes and contributions that we can make. Thank you.
In 18 months.
Just want to mention two big challenges on the openness front. You started to touch on it. It's the power of the private sector, and we're really seeing a privatization of governance, and that's a big challenge to the human rights framework, which is really directed to governments and their obligations to citizens. Second, on the multi-stakeholder issue, I think the question of representation is much more fraught than is generally acknowledged. And to even, there are many different types of processes relevant in different settings, and I think we all have to be careful when we claim all relevant actors at the table. That's a much more challenging thing than we sometimes acknowledge, even if we're fully supportive of the basic idea.
Good.
I would just like to congratulate you again for being able to push the Rome framework. I think it's a great success, and I look forward to seeing how the indicators are being developed. Also, I would like to offer Freedom House as a resource in any way that we can be helpful in this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, no, I'm just looking forward to the next stage.
And I think it's really timely. I mean, and after the WSIS Plus 10, where everybody agreed in principle on human rights, multi-stakeholder, it's really timely to have this to really see how it, those works in practice. And congrats to UNESCO for convening this dialogue and reaching out. Thank you.
And Guy, do you like to? Okay, thank you so much for your nice tweet, and also maybe WeChat, which has no limit of 140 words. And also, particularly want to thank all of you to commit for this lunchtime, and I wish you a nice lunch. Also, thanks our anonymous speakers and also our technical assistant in the room, and wish you all enjoy your lunch, which is well deserved. Thank you.